Humanity had always known it was small in the vast tapestry of the cosmos, but never had that truth been so brutally clear. The Galactic Empire, a behemoth of advanced technology and unrelenting power, had arrived in Earth's orbit 3 weeks ago, its warships blotting out the sun like an omen of extinction. The Empire's emissaries, cold and calculating, had broadcast their disdain for Earth's defenses, mocking humanity's rudimentary weaponry with cruel amusement. On the ground, Major Chris Keller stood at the edge of an old military base, staring at the horizon where faint lights of the Empire's orbital fleet glimmered like distant stars. A soldier in his late 30s, Chris carried the weight of too many battles in the lines etched across his face. His sharp blue eyes scanned the ruins of the world he'd sworn to protect, while his mind churned with frustration. Every tactical briefing, every desperate plan, felt like rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. Behind him, the camp was a patchwork of chaos. Soldiers hurriedly assembling barricades, engineers wrestling with ancient missile systems salvaged from forgotten arsenals, and medics tending to those who had already tasted the Empire's wrath. Chris's second-in-command, Lieutenant Richard Miller, jogged up to him, his voice tinged with grim urgency. "They hit Chicago this morning," Richard said, his tall, wiry frame silhouetted against the burning wreckage of a transport vehicle. 3 million dead. Their plasma cannons cut through our defenses like paper. Chris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at a rusted plaque embedded in the ground nearby. It marked the site as a museum, once a tribute to Earth's military history. The irony wasn't lost on him. Humanity's past glories were now relics against a foe that considered their existence a cosmic joke. "They think we're weak," Chris said finally, his voice a low rumble. "Because they don't understand us." Richard raised an eyebrow, his tone skeptical. "They've got ships the size of cities, Chris. We've got, what, rifles and a few scraps of tech? What don't they understand?" Chris turned, his gaze piercing, "that sometimes the simplest tools are the deadliest. It's not the weapon, it's the will behind it." That night, as the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, Chris found himself wandering through the dimly lit museum. Its exhibits were mostly destroyed or looted, but one corner remained intact, a section dedicated to the Second World War. His boots echoed against the cracked concrete as he approached the centerpiece. An M4 Sherman tank, its olive-green paint chipped but its frame sturdy, almost defiant. Memories stirred in Chris's mind. He thought of his grandfather, a grizzled old man who had fought in Vietnam and loved to tell stories about the great machines of his youth. Chris could still hear his gravelly voice. "Wars aren't won by gadgets, kid. They're won by guts." The tank seemed to embody that sentiment. It was a relic, obsolete in every way by modern standards. And yet, as Chris ran his hand along its cold metal surface, an idea began to take shape, a desperate, audacious plan that bordered on insanity. The next morning, Chris gathered a small team in the museum's shadow. Richard was there, skeptical as ever, along with Sergeant Dean Harris, an old-school mechanic with grease-stained hands and a perpetual scowl, and Private Will Smith, a fresh-faced recruit who looked like he belonged in a college classroom rather than a battlefield. They stood in a loose circle, exchanging puzzled glances. "All right, Major," Richard said, crossing his arms. "What's this about?" Chris gestured toward the tank. "This is our ace in the hole." Dean snorted. "You're kidding, right? That thing's older than my grandfather. It won't last 5 seconds against the Empire." "Exactly why it might work," Chris countered. "The Empire's tech is so advanced, it's become predictable. Their drones, their shields, their targeting systems. They all rely on algorithms that assume they're fighting modern technology. They won't know how to handle something like this." The skepticism was palpable, but Chris pressed on, his voice firm. "We retrofit it, reinforce the armor, upgrade the cannon, rig it with whatever alien tech we can scavenge. It won't win the war, but it might win us time, and a chance to hit them where it hurts." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Smith, wide-eyed but resolute, nodded. "I'm in." Dean sighed. shaking his head but stepping forward. "Guess I'd better make sure this old beast doesn't fall apart." Richard grumbled something under his breath, but finally relented. "If this gets us killed, I'm haunting you, Chris." Work began immediately. The camp's usual hum of activity shifted toward the museum, where the tank was dragged out into the open like a relic being unearthed from a tomb. Dean and Smith worked tirelessly, stripping away rusted components and replacing them with scavenged parts. Chris coordinated the effort, delegating tasks while constantly watching the horizon for signs of an Imperial assault. As days turned into nights, the team's bond grew stronger. Around a small fire one evening, they shared stories. Dean's tales of his time as a civilian mechanic, Smith's dreams of becoming a history teacher, Richard's gruff but heartfelt recounting of his family back home. Chris, though, remained mostly silent, his focus unwavering. Finally, after a grueling week, the tank was ready. Its exterior was a patchwork of old steel and alien alloys, its cannon retrofitted to fire both conventional shells and energy-based projectiles. Dean had even painted a crude emblem on its side, a fist smashing through a star. They christened it the Last Punch. As the team gathered for a final inspection, Chris climbed onto the tank's turret, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "This is it. The Empire doesn't think we can fight back. They think we're just another conquest. Let's show them what humanity can do." The team cheered, their voices carrying across the camp. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered in their eyes. At dawn, the tank rolled out, its engine growling like a beast awakening from slumber. Chris stood at its helm, his resolve hardened. The Empire thought Earth was weak, a mere stepping stone in their path to dominance. They were about to learn the hard way that humanity's strength lay not in its technology, but in its unyielding spirit. The Imperial landing craft descended like a storm, their engines thrumming with a mechanical precision that seemed to mock the chaos below. Waves of Imperial soldiers marched forth, their gleaming armor reflecting the pale light of Earth's shattered sky. The air crackled with tension, the kind that came before an inevitable, brutal clash. Major Chris Keller crouched low on a ridge, binoculars pressed against his face as he studied the enemy movements. Beside him, Richard Miller adjusted his rifle, his jaw tight. Behind them, hidden under a camouflaged tarp in the dense forest, the Last Punch lay in wait. Its newly reinforced hull caught the occasional glint of sunlight, but to the untrained eye, it was little more than a forgotten relic buried in the undergrowth. Chris lowered the binoculars, his expression grim. "They're splitting into 3 columns. Standard perimeter sweep. If they find us, we're done." Richard smirked faintly. "If they find us, they'll wish they hadn't." The faint whine of alien drones filled the air. Chris signaled to the rest of the crew, who waited nearby. Dean Harris, his face streaked with grease, gave the tank side a final pat before clambering aboard. Will Smith, nervously clutching a modified energy rifle, glanced at Chris, his youthful face pale but resolute. "Stick to the plan," Chris said, his voice steady but firm. "We hit fast, retreat, and hit again. Keep them guessing." As if on cue, the first column of Imperial soldiers appeared on the valley floor below. Their movements were mechanical, their formation flawless. Chris could see the shimmering distortion of their personal energy shields, the hallmark of their technological superiority. These weren't mere infantry. They were the vanguard, designed to crush resistance with overwhelming efficiency. Chris climbed into the tank's commander hatch, his heart pounding. "Dean, get us moving. Richard, take the gun. Smith, keep an eye out for those drones." The engine roared to life, a guttural growl that echoed through the forest. The tank lurched forward, its treads chewing through dirt and foliage as it emerged from its hiding spot. The Imperial soldiers stopped, their helmets tilting in unison as they registered the unexpected threat. Chris didn't wait for them to react. "Fire!" Richard squeezed the trigger, and the Sherman's main gun belched smoke and flame. The shell slammed into the lead soldier, his shield flickering for an instant before collapsing. The impact sent him flying into the ranks behind him, scattering them like leaves in the wind. For a moment, the Empire's soldiers hesitated. They had faced resistance before, but nothing like this. The tank's ancient design was a complete anomaly, defying every tactical prediction their systems had calculated. Then the Imperial commander barked an order, and the soldiers regrouped, their plasma rifles lighting up the air with deadly bolts of energy. Dean shouted from the driver's seat, "Shields holding, but not for long." Chris nodded, his mind racing. "Pull back now. Use the trees for cover." The tank reversed, its treads grinding as it disappeared into the dense forest. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air, carving glowing scars into the trees, but missing their target. The Imperial soldiers advanced cautiously, their precision giving way to wariness. From his perch in the tank, Richard grinned. "Looks like they don't like surprises." Chris leaned into the comms. "Good. Let's give them another." They doubled back, circling around to flank the second column. This time, Smith took the shot, his hands trembling but his aim true. The modified energy cannon mounted on the tank's turret discharged with a sharp hum, the projectile striking a supply drone at the rear of the enemy formation. The explosion rippled through the ranks, throwing soldiers to the ground and igniting a chorus of panicked shouts. The Sherman pressed the advantage, its turret swiveling as Richard rained fire into the scattering troops. The Empire's famed precision was unraveling, their reliance on rigid tactics proving a weakness against Chris's unorthodox strategy. But the battle was far from over. Overhead, the drones swooped lower, their sleek forms bristling with weaponry. Smith's voice cracked over the comms. "Drones incoming. 6 o'clock. Chris didn't hesitate. "Dean, full throttle. Get us to the ridge." The tank surged forward, the forest blurring around them. Plasma bolts from the drones scorched the ground in their wake, the impacts rattling the Sherman but failing to pierce its reinforced armor. Dean gritted his teeth, his hands steady on the controls as he navigated the uneven terrain. They reached the ridge, and Chris gave the order to halt. The tank's cannon roared again, this time targeting the drones. One by one, they exploded in midair, their fragments raining down like fiery confetti. 3 down, Richard reported, reloading the cannon. 2 more circling. "Make it quick," Chris said. "We've got company." The third column of Imperial troops was closing in, their formation tighter, their movements faster. They were learning, adapting, but so was Chris. He directed Dean to position the tank at a narrow choke point, forcing the enemy to funnel into a confined space. As the soldiers advanced, Richard unleashed a barrage of shells, each one tearing through shields and armor with relentless precision. The enemy faltered again, their advance stalling. Chris could see the frustration in their movements, the cracks forming in their perfect facade. He allowed himself a grim smile. They had underestimated humanity, and now they were paying the price. But victory was not yet assured. A distant rumble signaled the arrival of reinforcements, larger, heavier vehicles that dwarfed the Sherman in both size and firepower. Chris's smile faded, replaced by a steely determination. "Fall back to the secondary position," he ordered. "We're not done yet." As the Sherman retreated, its battered frame still defiant, Chris glanced back at the battlefield. The scorched earth and shattered trees bore testament to their first real victory against the Empire. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in weeks, Chris felt a flicker of hope. They had survived the first clash. Now, they had to prepare for the storm that was sure to follow. The air above the forest crackled with energy as the Empire's reinforcements arrived. Massive troop carriers and sleek fighter craft darkened the horizon, their ominous forms cutting through the morning haze. The rumble of Imperial walkers echoed like distant thunder, shaking the ground beneath Major Chris Keller's boots as he stared through his binoculars. Beside him, Richard Miller muttered a curse under his breath. "They're bringing everything this time," Richard said, his voice grim. "Looks like they didn't appreciate our little surprise." Chris lowered the binoculars and glanced back at his team, gathered around the battered Sherman tank. Dean Harris wiped his grease-covered hands on a rag, his perpetual scowl deepening as he inspected the tank's armor. Will Smith sat cross-legged nearby, nervously rechecking the energy rifle slung across his shoulder. The young soldier's face was pale, but his eyes burned with a determination that hadn't been there days ago. "They're escalating because we made them bleed," Chris said, his tone calm but resolute. "And if they're throwing more at us, it means they're scared." "Scared or pissed," Dean muttered, tapping the tank's hull. "Either way, we're going to need more than this old girl to handle what's coming." Chris's mind was already racing, piecing together the fragments of a plan. The Sherman had proven its worth in the first clash, but now it was battered, its armor pockmarked with scorch marks and dents. Against walkers and aircraft, even the reinforced modifications wouldn't hold for long. They needed an edge, something the Empire wouldn't see coming. He turned to Dean. "Can we integrate more of the alien tech into the tank?" Dean frowned, his brow furrowed. "Maybe. The energy disruptor we scavenged last week could boost the cannon's output, but it's risky. That thing's not exactly compatible with 20th century hardware." "Do it," Chris said without hesitation. "We don't have time to play it safe." Dean grumbled but nodded, already reaching for his tools. Smith jumped to his feet to help, his youthful enthusiasm a stark contrast to the mechanic's gruff demeanor. Meanwhile, Richard stepped closer to Chris, his voice low. "You really think we can pull this off again? They're learning, adapting. We can't keep surprising them forever." Chris met Richard's gaze, his voice steady. "No, we can't. But we don't need to. We just have to hold long enough for the rest of the world to see that they can fight back too." The next 12 hours were a blur of frantic activity. Dean and Smith worked tirelessly on the Sherman, stripping away damaged components and replacing them with scavenged alien tech. Sparks flew as they welded energy conduits to the cannon's frame, and the faint hum of the disruptor filled the air as it powered up for the first time. Chris and Richard focused on fortifying their position, laying traps and scouting the terrain for potential ambush points. Every move was calculated, every resource stretched to its limit. By nightfall, the tank was ready, or as ready as it could be. Dean slapped the hull with a mix of pride and exhaustion. "She's not pretty, but she'll hit like a sledgehammer." Chris ran a hand along the tank's side, his expression unreadable. He thought of the lives that depended on this battered machine, on the choices he and his team were making. There was no room for error. The Empire wouldn't grant them a second chance. The first attack came just before dawn. Imperial drones swept through the forest, their searchlights cutting through the darkness as they hunted for signs of resistance. Chris watched from the turret of the Sherman, his heart pounding as the lights drew closer. Then, with a single nod, he gave the signal. Richard fired the first shot, the tank's modified cannon roaring as it launched a projectile infused with energy from the disruptor. The shell struck a drone dead center, its explosion sending a shockwave that shattered two others in its wake. The remaining drones scattered, their formations breaking as they scrambled to adapt. "Keep moving," Chris shouted, his voice carrying over the din of the battle. Dean pushed the tank forward, its treads grinding through the underbrush as they repositioned. Plasma bolts rained down from the drones, but the tank's reinforced armor held firm, deflecting the worst of the damage. The Imperial infantry arrived next, their precise formations advancing through the trees. Chris's team had anticipated this, using the terrain to their advantage. Explosives rigged to tree trunks detonated as the soldiers passed, sending splinters and debris flying. The Empire's shields absorbed much of the impact, but the chaos disrupted their advance, forcing them into disarray. From the tank's turret, Richard picked off stragglers with the cannon, each shot punctuated by the heavy thud of the recoil. Smith provided covering fire from a nearby ridge, his energy rifle crackling with each pull of the trigger. The young soldier's hands trembled, but his aim was steady, his resolve unshaken. Despite their efforts, the Empire's reinforcements pressed on. Chris watched as the first walker emerged from the tree line, its towering frame bristling with weaponry. The ground trembled with each step it took, its cannon swiveling to lock onto the tank. "Walker incoming," Smith shouted, his voice tight with fear. Chris's mind raced. The Sherman was fast and agile for its size, but it couldn't outrun the Walker's firepower. They needed a way to bring it down, and fast. "Dean, full speed ahead," Chris ordered. "We're going straight for its legs." Dean hesitated for only a moment before slamming the throttle forward. The tank surged ahead, its engine roaring as it charged toward the towering machine. Plasma bolts rained down around them, the impact shaking the Sherman but failing to stop its advance. "Richard, aim for the joints," Chris shouted. The cannon fired, the modified shell striking the Walker's knee joint with a blinding flash. The machine stumbled, its balance wavering as sparks flew from the damaged limb. A second shot followed, then a third, and the Walker collapsed with a deafening crash, its massive frame carving a trench into the earth. Cheers erupted from the crew, but Chris's celebration was brief. More Walkers were approaching, their silhouettes visible against the rising sun. The Empire wasn't holding back, and neither could they. "Fall back to the fallback position," Chris commanded. "We'll regroup and hit them again." As the Sherman retreated, the team worked in unison, their movements instinctive after days of fighting together. Each member carried their weight, their individual strengths blending into a cohesive force. They had survived another wave, but the battle was far from over. Chris glanced at the horizon, where the Empire's forces gathered like an unrelenting tide. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: they weren't out of fight. This war wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving to the Empire and to themselves that humanity would never bow. The battlefield was a scarred wasteland, marked by craters, charred trees, and the twisted remains of fallen machines. Smoke rose in thick plumes, obscuring the early morning light. The Empire's forces were regrouping for a final, crushing assault. From the safety of a shallow ridge, Major Chris Keller surveyed the enemy's movements through the haze. Their numbers were staggering, an unending tide of soldiers, drones, and walkers advancing with mechanical precision. This was the endgame. Inside the Sherman, the crew was silent, each man absorbed in his own thoughts. Dean Harris leaned against the control panel, his face streaked with grime and exhaustion. "We're running on fumes here, Chris. Ammo's low, armor's shot to hell, and that disruptor's not going to hold much longer." "We don't need it to hold forever," Chris replied, his voice calm. "Just long enough." Will Smith, perched near the hatch with his rifle, glanced nervously at the advancing troops. "Long enough for what? There's too many of them. Even if we hit their lines, they'll just keep coming." Chris turned to the young soldier, his expression steely. "They'll keep coming if they think they're invincible. Our job is to prove they're not." Richard Miller, his hands resting on the tank's cannon controls, smirked faintly. "That's a tall order, boss. You got a plan, or are we just winging it again?" Chris nodded toward a distant hill. "See that ridge? It's the only way their walkers can maneuver through the valley. We take out the lead units, block the path, and funnel the rest into a kill zone. It's risky, but it's our best shot." Dean snorted. "Risky? That's suicidal." "Maybe," Chris said, his tone unyielding. "But if we don't stop them here, they'll roll over the rest of the resistance like a tidal wave. This is it, boys. All or nothing." The crew exchanged glances, their fear and doubt unspoken but palpable. Then Richard chuckled darkly, breaking the silence. "Well, hell, if this is how we go out, might as well make it count." The tank roared to life, its battered engine groaning as Dean pushed it to its limits. They sped toward the ridge, the ground trembling beneath their treads. Plasma fire erupted around them, streaks of light tearing through the smoke. Smith returned fire from the hatch, his shots picking off advancing infantry with practiced precision. As they neared the ridge, Chris barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Richard, aim for the lead walker's cockpit. Dean, keep us moving. Smith, watch our flank. The cannon fired, the modified disruptor shell slamming into the walker's cockpit with devastating force. The machine staggered, its pilot disoriented by the blast. A second shot followed, this one tearing through its leg joint. The walker toppled, its massive frame collapsing in a plume of dirt and debris. Direct hit, Richard shouted, his voice triumphant. One down. The Empire's troops scrambled to regroup, their lines faltering as the Sherman pressed its assault. Chris directed the tank to cut through their ranks, its treads crushing everything in its path. Explosions erupted around them as Richard unleashed the last of their shells, each shot finding its mark with deadly precision. But the Empire wasn't finished. Another wave of drones descended from the sky, their sleek forms bristling with weapons. Smith shouted a warning, his rifle blazing as he tried to hold them off. "We've got flyers inbound," he yelled. Chris's mind raced. They were out of heavy ammunition, and the disruptor's power was dwindling. He grabbed the comms, his voice sharp. "Dean, ram the next walker. Richard, prep the disruptor for a point-blank blast." "What?" Dean shouted, his eyes wide. "You're insane. Just do it." Chris snapped. "It's our only chance." Dean gritted his teeth and veered the tank toward the nearest walker, its towering frame looming like a mechanical titan. Plasma bolts rained down, striking the Sherman's weakened armor and rocking the crew inside. The tank plowed forward, its engine screaming in protest as it collided with the walker's leg. Metal groaned and buckled as the impact sent the massive machine stumbling. "Now, Richard," Chris ordered. Richard activated the disruptor, channeling its remaining energy into a single, concentrated blast. The shockwave tore through the walker, ripping it apart from the inside. The explosion was blinding, a fiery inferno that consumed everything in its radius. The force of the blast threw the Sherman backward, its tread skidding as it came to a halt. Inside, the crew was shaken but alive. Chris coughed, his ears ringing as he surveyed the scene. The ridge was a smoldering wreck, the Empire's lead units reduced to twisted metal and ash. "We did it," Smith said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We actually did it. Don't celebrate yet," Chris said, his tone grim. "They're regrouping." Through the smoke, the remaining Imperial forces advanced, their determination unbroken. But this time, they were slower, more cautious. The once unstoppable tide had been disrupted, their invincibility shattered. Chris climbed out of the tank, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "Dean, Richard, Smith, stay with the tank. Keep them busy. I'll handle the rest." "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded. "You can't take them on alone." Chris turned back, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm not alone. I just need to buy us a few minutes." Before they could argue, Chris sprinted toward the enemy lines, his movements swift and purposeful. He knew the Empire would focus on him, their disdain for human defiance overriding their tactical instincts. It was a gamble, but one he was willing to take. As he fired into the advancing troops, Chris could hear the faint sound of reinforcements arriving. Human reinforcements. The Resistance had seen the battle from afar and was rallying to their aid. A surge of hope coursed through him. They had held the line long enough. The Empire's forces hesitated, their advance faltering as explosions erupted behind them. The Resistance fighters swarmed in, their ragtag forces overwhelming the disoriented enemy. Chris fell back to the tank, his breath ragged but his spirit unbroken. The battle was over. The Empire's forces were retreating, their aura of invincibility shattered. For the first time, humanity had struck a decisive blow, a victory that would echo across the galaxy. As the crew gathered around the tank, battered but alive, Chris allowed himself a rare smile. "We just made history, boys." Dean chuckled, shaking his head. "History's gonna need a hell of a rewrite." Richard grinned, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. "Here's to the Sherman, the little tank that could Smith looked at Chris, his youthful face filled with newfound confidence. What now, sirs? Chris's smile faded, replaced by a steely resolve. Now! We show the galaxy what humanity can do. The team stood together, their eyes fixed on the horizon. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, they believed they could win.